At exactly 7:03 on a Tuesday morning, my phone lit up with a text from the HOA president. "We've had a complaint about a commercial vehicle in your driveway. Please move it within 24 hours. I didn't have to ask who filed it. Only one person in the neighborhood would wake up early just to ruin someone else's day. Karen. 40-something, aggressively blonde, with the uncanny ability to weaponize a yoga mat and gossip in the same breath. My commercial vehicle was a 15-year-old Ford F-350 with a dent in the bumper and my company logo magnetized to the doors. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid for my house, my property taxes, and the luxury of ignoring Karen, most of the time. That morning, though, her timing was a masterpiece. I had just finished a 12-hour shift hauling equipment for the city's utility department. My truck was dirty, my clothes smelled like diesel, and I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when the HOA's email pinged. I stepped outside to see Karen across the street, already in her garden robe, clutching her phone like she was live-streaming my downfall. She waved, more of a smug little two-finger salute, and mouthed something that looked like "rules are rules." It was almost cinematic, if the film was about petty suburban warfare. I sipped my coffee, gave her a lazy nod, and walked back inside. If she wanted to play HOA chess, fine. But she was about to realize I had been playing HOA poker for years, and I was holding a loaded deck. The thing Karen didn't know, yet, was that my work contract with the city included towing services. I didn't just drive the truck. I also had a municipal tow license. In most neighborhoods, that was meaningless. In ours, it was a golden ticket, because while the HOA could write nasty letters, only someone like me could legally remove a car from a public street if it violated certain ordinances. And Karen, bless her self-righteous heart, had a habit of parking her Lexus in front of my house, temporarily, whenever her driveway was blocked by one of her many delivery trucks or landscapers. That afternoon, I decided not to move my truck. I parked it exactly where it had been, washed it so it gleamed, and remagnetized the logo to make it look extra commercial. By dinner time, I noticed Karen's Lexus was sitting in its favorite illegal spot, front bumper 2 feet into the fire lane, rear bumper kissing my mailbox. I could almost hear the faint chorus of opportunity knocking. Of course, I didn't tow her car right away. That would be obvious and satisfyingly petty, but petty was Karen's sport. I preferred precision. So, I spent the evening gathering screenshots of HOA bylaws, municipal parking ordinances, and a copy of my city tow contract, neatly highlighted. If this was going to be a move, it was going to be a checkmate, not just a jab. The next morning, the HOA sent a follow-up email demanding I move my truck by noon or face fines. Karen was back on her porch, sunglasses on, coffee in hand, like the neighborhood was her personal reality show. I walked out, inspected my truck like I was considering compliance, then instead took out my phone and dialed the city dispatch. "Got a vehicle blocking a fire lane," I said casually. "Make sure to send it to the municipal lot, not the private one." "Yep, license plate KRN. I glanced up just in time to see her tilt her head, curious. She didn't yet realize she was the main character in this call. 20 minutes later, the tow truck arrived, one of ours, ironically, and I signed the release paperwork with a grin. The driver hooked her Lexus while I stood there sipping coffee. Karen came flying out of her house, shrieking about misunderstandings, emergencies, and how dare you. The driver, bless his professional detachment, just pointed to the fire lane paint and shrugged. "You can't do this," she barked at me, half blocking the tow truck in her desperation. "It's not your job to decide." I held up my signed contract from the city. "Actually it is," I said calmly. "And according to both the HOA rules you love quoting and the city ordinance, that spot is illegal. But I'm sure you can appeal it. At the municipal impound lot. Downtown. Before 5 p.m. The best part wasn't her jaw dropping, it was the subtle shift in the crowd. Yes, there was a crowd. Neighbors had emerged from driveways and porches like prairie dogs, clutching coffee mugs and trying to look casual. This was better than cable. I caught snippets of whispers. Finally, and about time. Karen followed the tow truck down the street, still yelling, leaving her front door wide open. I went back inside, finally finished my coffee, and started my day with a sense of cosmic balance. For the first time in years, I had the upper hand, and I knew she wouldn't let it go. That was fine, neither would I. Because in this neighborhood, grudges didn't fade. They evolve. And something told me this was only the opening move. By the next morning, I knew the tow had hit Karen harder than I'd anticipated. Normally, she strutted around the block like a mall security guard who'd just broken up a food court brawl, but that day, she was oddly quiet. Her Lexus was back in the driveway, gleaming like it had been professionally detailed, probably her way of restoring dignity, but the real clue was the way she avoided eye contact when I drove past in my truck. That wasn't an apology. Karen didn't apologize. That was something better. That was plotting. I've been in enough neighbor disputes to know that silence from someone like Karen isn't peace, it's recon. She'd be in her kitchen right now, laptop open, flipping between the HOA bylaws and whatever social media groups she used to crowdsource her vendettas. My guess? She was already cooking up a retaliation that would look like civic duty on paper, but feel like a sucker punch in real life. By mid-afternoon, the first shot landed. The HOA sent me a notice of violation claiming my truck was stored on the premises for commercial purposes, and that operating a business from a residential property was against community rules. It came complete with a grainy, zoomed-in photo of my driveway, and whose front yard shrubbery perfectly framed the shot. Karen's. I called the HOA office, expecting to explain the situation to someone reasonable. Instead, I got Phil, the HOA's compliance officer, who sounded like he'd swallowed a rulebook at birth. "Sir, this is a residential community, not a commercial lot," he said with the bored authority of a DMV clerk. "I'm not operating a business from my driveway," I replied. "My truck is a work vehicle. I drive it home after shift. Just like the police cruiser parked outside Officer Daly's place." "That's different," Phil said without hesitation. "Law enforcement vehicles are permitted." "Ah, so if I put flashing lights on mine, we're good?" He didn't laugh. "Sir, you have 7 days to comply." When I hung up, Karen was in her driveway, watering her flowers in a sweatshirt that screamed "I'm spying" but pretending not to. She gave me a little wave, the kind you'd give someone as you pass them in the grocery store after stealing the last box of their favorite cereal. I didn't wave back. This was the problem with Karen. She thought rules were her personal arsenal, and she believed she could weaponize them without blowback. But what she didn't understand was that I'd spent years working with the city, navigating codes, ordinances, and loopholes. I knew exactly how far I could push without breaking the law. And she had just given me the perfect excuse to push. The next day, I parked my truck on the street instead of the driveway, directly in front of her house. Legal as long as I moved it every 48 hours, and I planned to move it every 47. Karen came out within 20 minutes, robe cinched tight, phone in hand. She paced around my truck like she was inspecting a crime scene, probably looking for any infraction she could cite. When she realized it was perfectly legal, she gave me a look that could have curdled milk and retreated inside. The retaliation came that evening. I got home from work to find an orange violation sticker slapped across my mailbox. Apparently, it was not in compliance with the approved community design. My mailbox, plain black, regulation height, and installed by the same contractor who'd done half the neighborhood, was suddenly a problem after 3 years. I peeled the sticker off and laughed. She'd gone from legal to petty in 24 hours. But she'd also made a mistake. In our HOA, mailbox violations required an in-person inspection by the board before any fine could be issued, which meant Karen had either faked the notice herself or convinced the board to act without a vote. Both were violations in themselves. I decided to test her. The next morning, I parked my truck halfway up my driveway so it still stuck out over the sidewalk, Technically fine as long as it didn't block pedestrian access. Karen came out mid-call, probably to the HOA office, gesturing toward my truck like a police witness giving a description of a suspect. She saw me watching and plastered on a fake smile, mouthing, "Just following rules." 2 days later, the HOA president himself showed up at my door. Mark was a decent guy, the kind who volunteered for the board to keep the peace rather than fuel drama. He held a manila folder and looked tired. "Got a stack of complaints here," he said, handing me a printout. "All from the same resident. About your truck, your mailbox, and, get this, your lawn height." "My lawn height?" I asked, stepping outside so he could see the freshly mowed perfection. "Yeah," he sighed. "I'm supposed to remind you it can't exceed 3 inches. Which, as far as I can tell, it doesn't." He flipped through the papers. "Look, I'm going to level with you. I'm getting pressure to enforce these because Karen's saying if I don't, she'll mobilize the board." Her words. That was the thing about Karen, she didn't just play dirty, she played loud. And if she couldn't get what she wanted through the rules, she'd make enough noise that people enforced them just to shut her up. I could have backed down then. Moved the truck, replaced the mailbox, let her have her little victory. But I'd towed her Lexus, and she wasn't going to forgive me for that. She'd just keep coming. Which meant the only way to stop her was to make her realize she couldn't win. So I smiled at Mark and said, "Tell her I'm happy to comply. But only if she does too. And you might want to remind her that the board has to follow its own bylaws." Mark raised an eyebrow, probably guessing I had something planned. I did. That weekend I did some quiet research. Turns out, Karen's beloved Lexus wasn't her only car. She also had a beat-up little SUV parked 2 streets over, which she used for her dog grooming side hustle. According to city code, any vehicle used for business purposes that was stored overnight in a residential area had to be registered differently and meet certain requirements. And wouldn't you know it, her SUV had a cracked taillight and expired registration tags. Monday morning, I drove my truck to that street, legally parked, of course, and took a few photos. Later that day, I called the same city department she'd tried to sick on me. "Commercial vehicle in a residential zone," I said, sending them the pictures. "Might be worth a look." By Tuesday afternoon, Karen's SUV had a bright yellow citation on the windshield. She stormed into my driveway not long after, waving it like it was a ransom note. "You did this," she hissed. "I don't write tickets," I said calmly. "I just follow the rules. You know, like you always tell me to." She glared at me for a long moment, then turned on her heel and stomped away. I could tell this wasn't over. But I could also tell she'd underestimated me. Because now, the game wasn't about her hating my truck. It was about her realizing I could play by her rules, and still beat her. And I was just getting warmed up. Karen didn't appear on my radar for the next 2 days, which was almost more unnerving than her usual barrage of attacks. In a neighborhood like ours, a quiet Karen was a storm front forming over still water. Sure enough, the tension broke on Thursday afternoon when I got home from work to find a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk in front of my driveway. At the center, like a director orchestrating her magnum opus, was Karen, holding a clipboard and speaking in that loud, performative voice she used when she wanted the whole street to hear. "And as you can see, this is a repeated violation," she announced, gesturing toward my truck as if it were a caged tiger. "The HOA covenants are clear. No long-term parking of commercial vehicles in residential zones. The community deserves better than having to look at this every day." She noticed me approaching and turned with a smile so polished it could have been a warning label for artificial sweeteners. "Oh, hi," she said, as though we'd just bumped into each other at the farmer's market. "We're just having an informal gathering to discuss property value concerns. You don't mind, do you?" "I do," I said, walking past her toward my front door. "Mostly because I don't recall consenting to my driveway being a public meeting space." Her smile tightened, but she didn't break character. We're just neighbors looking out for each other. You wouldn't want your truck to drag down the whole street's home values, would you? Home values seem fine, I said, unlocking my door. But if you're worried, I can always move the truck. I let that hang for a beat before adding, right in front of your house again. A few of the onlookers smirked and Karen's jaw twitched. She muttered something about community spirit and turned back to her audience. I went inside, but the image of her orchestrating a street-side kangaroo court stuck with me. She wasn't just trying to make my life inconvenient anymore. She was trying to make me the villain in her little suburban drama. And if she wanted an audience, I could give her one. That night, I printed out copies of the actual city ordinance regarding commercial vehicles. I highlighted the clause that made my truck fully compliant when parked on a public street or my own driveway. The next morning, while the dew was still on the grass, I taped one copy to my mailbox and another to the side of my truck, laminated, just in case Karen decided to stage a rainstorm with her garden hose. By the time I came home from work that day, the papers were gone. In their place was a fresh HOA final warning stuffed into my doorframe. The letter threatened daily fines if I didn't remove my non-compliant vehicle within 72 hours. And at the bottom, in tiny italic print, it read, "Complaint filed by resident at 224 Evergreen Lane." That was Karen's address. She dropped the mask entirely. I didn't get mad. I got methodical. If she wanted to escalate to official channels, I'd escalate to ones she couldn't control. That evening, I called the city's public works department, not to complain about her car this time, but to request a temporary construction permit. My driveway needed resurfacing, I explained, which meant I'd need to park my work vehicle on the street for several days. I filed the paperwork, paid the small fee, and by the next afternoon, I had a bright orange permit posted on my mailbox. City-issued, official, and completely immune to HOA enforcement. The look on Karen's face when she saw it was something I'll carry with me for years. She walked past slowly, phone in hand, eyes darting between the permit and my truck like she was trying to find a flaw in a master forgery. Finally, she snapped a photo, probably to send to Phil the compliance officer, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The city's authority trumped the HOA's every time. For 2 days she stewed. Then she shifted tactics. I came home Saturday to find a folded flyer under my doormat. Community Beautification Day, mandatory participation. It listed a date, 3 weeks out, and an agenda that included addressing property violations and eliminating eyesores. At the bottom, in bold, was a note: all residents are expected to comply. Non-participation will be noted. The organizer? Karen, naturally. She wasn't going to win in court or with the city, so she was going to try mob rule. If she could rally enough neighbors against me, she might get a vote to rewrite the HOA bylaws. And I'll admit, for a moment I considered just skipping town that day. But then I realized something. If she wanted to make it a public showdown, that was exactly where I could beat her the hardest. In the days leading up to Beautification Day, I became the model neighbor. I mowed my lawn twice, edged the sidewalks, even replanted the flower bed by my front walk. I waved to everyone, offered to help carry groceries, and let a few people borrow tools from my garage. When they complimented the improvements, I made sure to casually mention the flyer Karen had dropped off, complete with the eyesore reference. By the week of the event, at least 4 neighbors had told me they thought it was a bit much. On Beautification Day, I rolled my truck out early, freshly washed and waxed, with an American flag fluttering from the antenna. I parked it right in front of my house, Orange City permit still displayed, and set up a cooler of bottled water on the tailgate for volunteers. By the time Karen arrived, clipboard in hand, there were already a half-dozen neighbors chatting and sipping water around my truck. "Good morning," I called cheerfully. "Perfect day for community service, isn't it?" Her eyes narrowed. "We'll be starting with the properties most in need of attention," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And some of us know exactly where those are." "Great," I said. I've already done mine, so I'll be free to help with others. Where should I start? Your place. That earned a couple of chuckles from the crowd, and Karen's cheeks flushed. She quickly moved the group toward a house down the block with an overgrown hedge, pretending not to hear me. I spent the morning trimming hedges, hauling trash bags, and generally making myself look like the poster child for neighborhood pride. Every time Karen tried to steer the conversation toward unsightly commercial vehicles, someone would change the subject or point out how much I'd already done. By noon, it was obvious her campaign wasn't landing the way she'd hoped. That's when she made her fatal misstep. She walked over to my truck, pulled the city permit off the mailbox, and stuffed it into her clipboard. "This," she announced, "isn't valid anymore. It expired yesterday." I didn't have to say a word. Mark, the HOA president, happened to be passing by and stopped in his tracks. "Karen," he said slowly, "you can't just take someone's city-issued permit. It's public property once it's posted," she argued, but even she sounded unsure. "No," Mark said, "it's tampering with official documentation. You could get fined." The silence that followed was the kind you could feel in your teeth. Karen's eyes darted from Mark to me, and for the first time since this whole mess started, I saw something new there. Not anger, not smugness, just the faint glimmer of realization that maybe she'd overplayed her hand. The week after Beautification Day felt strangely quiet. Karen's Lexus stayed tucked neatly in her driveway, her blinds were half drawn more often than not, and I caught only brief glimpses of her. Usually early in the morning, dressed for one of her endless committee meetings, in pastel blazers that looked like they'd been bought in bulk. It would have been tempting to think she was done, but Karen didn't quit, she reloaded. I knew better than to drop my guard. The first sign came on Tuesday evening when I found a folded letter from the HOA taped to my door. It wasn't a violation this time, it was a notice of hearing. Apparently, the board would be meeting in 2 weeks to address recurring concerns regarding property compliance. The letter was written in sterile legalese, but the translation was obvious. Karen was gunning for me in an official setting, hoping to corner me in a room where she'd have the advantage. Mark, the HOA president, called me later that night. "Look, I didn't schedule this," he said. "Karen filed a formal request, which means we have to hear it." "Let me guess," I said. "She's going to argue my truck is lowering property values, destroying the fabric of the community, and frightening small children?" "You joke," Mark said, "but that's pretty close to her written complaint. She's even bringing a presentation." A presentation. Karen's idea of public speaking was basically performance art, overwrought, self-righteous, and designed to make you feel like you'd been summoned to the principal's office. I could already picture the PowerPoint, grainy zoomed-in photos of my driveway, red circles around imaginary infractions, maybe even a stock image or two of beautiful truck-free neighborhoods. 2 weeks was more than enough time for me to prepare my own counterattack. And unlike Karen, I wasn't just going to rely on emotional theatrics. I was going to bury her in facts, law, and, most importantly, public embarrassment. The first thing I did was call in a favor from a buddy at the city's zoning office. He emailed me a letter confirming that my truck, as used and parked, was fully compliant with all municipal ordinances. Then I called the Public Works Department to confirm that my commercial tow license allowed me to operate and park the truck anywhere in the city, including residential neighborhoods, without restriction. Another letter in my inbox within 24 hours. The real jewel, though, came from the city attorney's office. I asked if there was any precedent for HOAs overstepping their authority into areas covered by municipal code. Not only was there precedent, there was an entire memo on it, complete with case numbers and rulings, all stating that when local law and HOA rules conflicted, the city's authority prevailed. By the end of the week, I had a 3-ring binder thick enough to use as a doorstop, filled with certified letters, highlighted ordinances, and printed legal opinions. But I wasn't stopping at paperwork. If Karen wanted a show, I'd give her one. I spent the next weekend detailing my truck, until it looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line. Fresh wax, chrome polish to a mirror finish, even a subtle pine-scented air freshener inside. Then, because I knew optics mattered, I stenciled a small American flag decal on the tailgate. Not gaudy, just tasteful enough to make criticizing the truck feel vaguely unpatriotic. In the days leading up to the meeting, I played it cool. Karen, on the other hand, was in full campaign mode. I caught her more than once chatting with neighbors on their driveways, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear snippets like, "eyesore," "lowering our standard," and "if we don't enforce the rules, what's next?" She was trying to rally votes ahead of time, probably hoping for an ambush. The night of the meeting, I arrived early, binder under my arm, wearing my cleanest work shirt and boots polished enough to pass inspection. The HOA's conference room was in the community center, a bland beige space with folding chairs and a faint smell of burned coffee. A few board members were already seated at the long table up front. Mark gave me a nod. Karen, sitting 3 seats down from him, was shuffling papers and adjusting a small portable projector she'd clearly brought from home. By the time the meeting started, at least 20 neighbors had shown up. This wasn't normal attendance. It was a crowd. Karen had made sure this would be a spectacle. She went first, standing at the front with her clipboard and clicking through a PowerPoint titled, "Preserving the Beauty of Evergreen Lane." It was every bit as melodramatic as I'd imagined. Blurry photos of my truck in various lighting conditions, captions like, "not in keeping with our community's vision," and a slide comparing property values in our neighborhood to those in a nearby HOA that banned work vehicles. She even threw in a picture of a derelict pickup rusting in a field, as though my freshly waxed F-350 was one bad week away from turning into it. When she was done, she smiled sweetly and said, "This isn't personal, it's about protecting all of our investments." Then she sat down, looking at me like she'd just driven the final nail in my coffin. Mark gestured for me to speak. I stood, set my binder on the table, and opened it with deliberate slowness. "Thank you, Karen, for your concern about community aesthetics," I began. "It's good to know we all care so much about rules, especially when those rules actually exist." The first few pages were copies of the municipal code, highlighted to show that my vehicle was compliant in every way. Then came the letters from zoning, public works, and the city attorney's office. I read key excerpts aloud, making sure to emphasize phrases like "protected under municipal law" and "exempt from HOA regulation." But I didn't stop there. I flipped to a final section labeled Community Impact, which contained glossy photos I'd taken over the past week of my truck being used for charity work, hauling building materials for a Habitat for Humanity project, transporting donated furniture for a local shelter. Each photo had a date stamp and a short note from the organizer thanking me for my help. "So, while my truck may not be a convertible sports car," I said, looking directly at Karen, "it does serve a purpose. A purpose that benefits the community far more than the time and energy wasted filing baseless complaints." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. Mark looked impressed. Karen's lips pressed into a tight line. When the board deliberated, they didn't just dismiss her complaint, they voted unanimously to issue a formal warning to any member who filed repeated, unfounded violations without evidence. It was, without naming her, a direct slap on the wrist. Karen didn't storm out, she was too proud for that, but she gathered her papers with a sharp snap and left before the meeting was officially adjourned. I lingered, chatting with a few neighbors who slapped me on the back and muttered things like, "Nice work," and about time someone stood up to her. As I walked to my truck, I saw her Lexus parked under one of the streetlights. She was in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, fingers tight on the steering wheel. I half expected her to roll down the window and say something, anything, but she didn't. She just started the engine and drove off without a glance in my direction. It didn't take long for Karen to prove me right. For a week after the HOA meeting, she disappeared from the social landscape like a submarine going silent, but I could feel her circling beneath the surface. Then, on a Sunday morning so still you could hear the sprinklers 2 blocks over, she made her move. I came out to get the paper and found my truck sitting in the driveway with a bright yellow, unsafe vehicle sticker plastered across the driver's side window. It wasn't from the HOA. This one had the city's logo on it. That got my attention. I peeled it off carefully, reading the fine print. According to the notice, my truck had been reported as mechanically unsafe for public operation and required an inspection within 48 hours or it could be impounded. There was no date of violation listed, which told me it wasn't from a random patrol officer. Someone had filed this through the city's online reporting system. Someone who knew exactly how to word it to trigger the inspection order. Karen had found a new angle. I didn't panic. The truck was in perfect working order. I maintained it better than most people maintain their own cars. But I wasn't about to let her get away with this stunt. I called the city's vehicle compliance office and scheduled the inspection for the next morning. Then I made one more call, this time to my dispatcher at the utility department. "Hey Jim," I said. "You know how my truck's licensed for municipal towing? And you know how we've got those contracts with the city for emergency impounds?" "Yeah," he said slowly, already suspicious. "Well, I've got a feeling I'm going to have an interesting opportunity in the next couple of days. I just want to make sure I'm cleared to act on it if it comes up." Jim chuckled. "You're always up to something, aren't you? As long as it's by the book, go for it." The inspection the next morning was almost boring in its predictability. The city mechanic ran through the checklist, brakes, lights, emissions, and found absolutely nothing wrong. He signed off the paperwork, shook his head, and muttered, "Some people really don't have enough to do." I left with the inspection clearance form, laminated it at the office, and taped it right where the sticker had been. For the rest of the day, I parked my truck in the driveway with the hood up, just to bait her into thinking she'd actually caused a problem. Sure enough, by late afternoon, I saw her Lexus creep past slowly, her head tilted to get a better look. I made a show of wiping my hands on a rag and closing the hood with a dramatic slam. The trap was set. That evening, just as the sun dipped low, I spotted her Lexus parked illegally again, half blocking the hydrant at the corner of our street. It wasn't unusual for her to stop there briefly while unloading groceries, but this time, the car sat there for over 20 minutes, long enough to cross the line from lazy parking to clear violation. I didn't even have to think twice. I pulled out my work phone, called dispatch, and said, "I've got a hydrant obstruction, plate KRN." The operator knew me well enough not to ask questions. 10 minutes later, the tow truck I'd arranged to be on standby rolled up. Not one of the usual city contractors. My truck. I'd volunteered for this shift, and nobody else was touching this job. Hooking her Lexus was a symphony of mechanical precision. I lowered the boom, locked the wheel lift in place, and had the rear tires off the ground before she even came outside. The sound of her door slamming echoed down the block like a starter pistol, and then came the shrill voice I'd been expecting. "What do you think you're doing?" I didn't look up from securing the straps. "Removing a vehicle obstructing a fire hydrant. Public safety hazard." "That's my car," she snapped, marching up to me. "You can't just—" "Actually, I can," I said, holding up the laminated inspection clearance for my truck like it was a trophy. "Fully licensed, fully authorized, and unlike some people, I actually follow the rules." She sputtered, glancing around for support, but the audience forming on the sidewalk wasn't on her side. A few neighbors were filming on their phones. Someone even called out, "Fire hydrant Karen," in a mocking sing-song. "This is harassment," she yelled, but there was no conviction in it. She knew she'd been caught red-handed. "Harassment is filing false safety complaints about someone's vehicle," I said evenly, tightening the last strap. This is enforcement." The moment I started lifting the Lexus fully off the ground, she switched tactics from outrage to desperation. "Wait, can't we just— I mean, I'll move it right now." "Too late," I said, climbing into the cab. Once the tow process has started, it goes to impound. City rules. Her voice cracked as she shouted after me, "You'll regret this!" But it was drowned out by the rumble of the engine as I pulled away, her car swaying gently behind mine. The impound lot clerk barely looked up when I rolled in. She processed the paperwork, and by the time I left, Karen's Lexus was locked behind a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. She could get it back the next day, after paying the release fee, the towing fee, and a ticket for blocking the hydrant. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing with texts from neighbors. "Legend, about time, please tell me you got that on video." Apparently, half the block had watched the whole thing unfold. Karen, on the other hand, didn't make an appearance for 2 full days. When she finally emerged, it was to collect her mail, moving briskly from door to box like she was trying to avoid eye contact with the world. I noticed the Lexus was back in her driveway, cleaner than I'd ever seen it, probably detailed at the lot to erase any trace of the incident. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The beauty of that final tow wasn't just that I'd turned her own tactics against her. It was that I'd done it legally, publicly, and in a way she couldn't spin as victimhood without exposing her own pettiness. The court of neighborhood opinion had ruled, and the verdict was clear. In the weeks that followed, she stopped filing complaints about my truck. She still scowled when she saw it, still whispered to the couple next door when I drove past, but the constant harassment was gone. The HOA meetings were quieter. The violation notices stopped. Every now and then, I'd catch her watching from her window when I backed my truck into the driveway after a long day, the chrome glinting in the evening sun. I'd give a small nod, not as a taunt, but as a reminder. We both knew what had happened. We both knew who had won. And deep down, I think she knew I'd never needed to beat her at her own game. I just had to play it better.